Y'all ready to get stronger today? I know I'm ready. We're going to talk about muscles today, okay? So the three topics I'm going to briefly go through today are motor units. What are they? How do they work? How are they different throughout the body? I'm going to talk about the strength of contractions in your muscle. What three factors primarily influence the strength of your contractions? And then finally, we're going to talk about the types of movement. And this is especially with exercise. So you've probably heard these terms before. I'm just going to clarify them for you. So let's get started with the first aspect, motor neurons. Last week we talked about neurons, right? And how they come and they innervate the muscle cell, right? That was called the neuromuscular junction. So basically, if we want to move a muscle, a skeletal muscle specifically, we need to send an action potential, a signal, down a neuron and basically tell the muscle to contract. We went over all the steps in the last lecture. Now, motor units are basically, we're saying that there is a motor neuron coming down from the brain spinal cord, right? And we are going to tell muscle fibers, muscle cells, to contract. In reality, one motor neuron could potentially control several dozen to several hundred muscle fibers at once. So what makes the difference if it has a few branches versus a ton of branches? We're going to talk about that. So let's say we have one motor neuron innervating about 10 muscle fibers, because each muscle fiber has its own terminal end of the neuron, which is called an axon. So basically, all of these branches are called axons. They're just little branches off from the main motor neuron. Okay? So let's say one motor neuron comes down, innervates 10 muscle fibers. Well, let's contrast that to what if one motor neuron came down and connected and branched off to 1,000 different muscle fibers. This actually occurs in your body. There are some muscle groups that have fewer axons per motor neuron, okay? And there are some parts of your body that has one motor neuron innervating literally thousands of muscle fibers. So let's think about this. If only one signal gets sent down the motor neuron, so this motor neuron is activated, it's going to activate all of these muscle fibers. There's only 5 in this case, so a very small number. But think about if one motor neuron connected to thousands of muscle fibers. Which one would you have better control over? If you think about it, you will have more fine control over the motor neurons that only innervate a small number of muscle fibers. So the fewer the number of muscle fibers per neuron, this is going to be fine motor movements. These are things like your fingers, your hands, your facial expressions. You know how you can just partially adjust so many aspects of your hands and your face to show expressions, to do very delicate movements? There are going to be a ton of motor neurons coming into those areas to basically tell a very small number of muscle fibers to move. And since you have such fine control over those, you can move them in several different orientations for facial expressions, for grabbing, doing other things with your hands. Whereas, if you have one motor neuron coming down and innervating thousands of muscle fibers, so a large number of muscle fibers, this is going to be more large-scale movement. So if we think about that, there are motor neurons that go down to your legs, perhaps your rectus femoris, your vastus lateralis, big muscle groups in your legs where only a few motor neurons are coming down and innervating thousands to millions of muscle cells to contract them in a very large-scale manner. You don't have as much fine control over these because you simply just don't have as many motor neurons going to the area. One is going to control a lot of muscle fibers, okay? So that is a motor neuron and a motor unit. So one motor unit would be basically the motor neuron combined with all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. That's a good definition for a motor unit. Awesome. If you have questions, drop it in the comments below. I'd appreciate questions. Now, when talking about muscle strength, so when we're actually contracting our muscles and we want to produce some sort of force to do helpful work, there are 3 factors that we can think of that will influence the strength of your contraction. One is probably obvious. If you look at me, kind of skinny, versus a bodybuilder, the bodybuilder can likely make a lot more strength in his or her contractions. That is because the muscle cells themselves have hypertrophy. So they have gotten bigger. So the size of the muscle fibers, so generally speaking, you could say we have more muscle fibers, more muscle cells in general, or the individual muscle fibers or muscle cells have more contractile units per myofibril. So if we remember what muscle cells look like, if you were to draw them, you have a muscle cell, and within the muscle cell, you will have several units that run the length of the muscle cell, little tubes, and these are your myofibrils. Okay, these are the ones that contain the sarcomeres, which are the contractile units, which we'll talk about in a second. So if we were to enlarge either the muscle cell itself or maybe increase the size or density of the myofibrils, we'll have more sarcomeres, therefore we'll have more strength in our contractions. Okay? That's the first aspect. Second aspect, this one's interesting. These are both sarcomeres, and I've drawn them in two different orientations. In this one, the muscle is lengthened out. Okay, so if you were to look at the sarcomeres of my bicep right now, they are fully stretched out. Whereas here, they're half shortened. Okay, think about which one could produce a stronger muscle contraction. Well, if we think about it in terms of how many cross bridges are forming between myosin and actin, remember myosin interacts with actin to pull those Z-lines together to contract. So here we've only got 1, 2, 3, 4 cross bridges that can form in this drawing. So it's going to be a rather weak contraction. That's why it's really hard to lift something when you're fully lengthened out in your muscle. Like in a bicep curl, when you're lifting a weight, it's really hard to get it up that first part. But then, once you get it to about here, it's a lot easier to finish the contraction. Why? Because let's count all the cross bridges that form between myosin and actin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. A lot more than the 4, right? So it's a lot easier because you're recruiting more myosin, pulling the actin, and they're just more available to make those cross bridges when your muscle is partially shortened. So when it's lengthened, there's going to be less force generated because there's fewer cross bridges, and this one's going to be able to produce more force. So the length of your muscle at contraction can influence the muscle strength at that time. Lastly, I'm going to set a scenario for you. I'm sure this has never happened to any of you. Let's say you go to the gym for the first time in 2 years, and you decide to squat. And as you get up to that bar, and you put it behind you, and you go down, and now you try to go back up. And you just kind of pause there for a second because your muscles are like, we haven't done this for a while. And so slowly they activate and you're able to stand up. Well, why was it so difficult to get that first contraction happening? Well, if we think about it, motor neuron sends the signal to the muscle fibers, right? If you don't use your motor neurons very often, you're going to lose their function. You're going to lose their ability to send good signals. So the strength of the signal from your neuron can definitely influence your muscle contraction. So strength of signal from your motor neurons themselves, as well as how many signals you can send per second. So it's the frequency of the signal. The more action potentials you send per second, the stronger the muscle will contract because more acetylcholine will bind and so forth down the line so that you can contract your sarcomeres. So these are the 3 things that can impact your muscle strength. Now, other things could probably impact it, like energy availability, exhaustion, the tearing of the muscle fibers. All those could also impact, but these are 3 good general things to remember. Lastly, muscular motion. There are 2 types of muscle, I'm going to say exercises. Okay, so when we go to exercise, we move our muscles. Okay, but there are certain movements that are classified differently. So the 2 different classes are called isotonic exercises, and then there's going to be isometric exercises. Within isotonic, these are going to be where you actively see motion of the muscle. Isometric, you're not going to see any motion. So your body is going to be still, or that muscle group is going to be still. It's going to hold its place. So let's talk about the two types of isotonic movements. There is concentric and there is eccentric, okay? I think it's easier to see them, so I'm going to demonstrate. Say I have this marker, it's a weight, so I'm lifting about as much as SpongeBob. Say my muscle's fully stretched out, and I'm going to bring up this marker. Think about my bicep. As I am contracting, my bicep is shortening under load. So this is a weight, and I'm contracting, shortening my muscle, and it has some tension there. That is a concentric exercise. The muscle is shortening under load. Okay, so concentric is muscle shortens under load, so under force. Whereas eccentric, so I've fully contracted it, eccentric is going to be, I'm going to lengthen my muscle under load. So my bicep during this motion is lengthening, lengthening, lengthening under stress from the weight, but I'm keeping it slow, right? So if you put your muscles under strain, as you extend them, it is called eccentric exercises. So a muscle lengthens under load. All right? These two exercises are great at building strength, okay? But isometric is non-moving exercise. So think about if you're holding a plank, okay? You're on the ground, you're planking, your body's not moving. Those are all isometric exercises. Same with if I'm doing like wall squats. If I sit here, oh, my muscles are tense, so they're working, but I'm holding the position. So the muscle is neither lengthening nor shortening, but it is under tension. That would be isometric. And these are really good exercises for stability. So if you are an athlete, try to do both concentric, eccentric exercises, more for strength and burst. Isometric is really good for stabilizing, making all muscle groups work together so you can stay stable when you are playing whatever sport you are playing. So that's a crash course of these, trip over my cord. These are a crash course of these first three topics. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk through anaerobic and aerobic respiration, as well as the different muscle fiber types. I hope this was helpful. Be sure to like and subscribe and drop any questions you have in the comments.